All right. Well, hey there, everyone. It's the day after Mother's Day. And man, we have a special Digging Deeper because we got a first-timer here.
Hey!
We've got our next-gen pastor, Mariah Sherman, who was a part of our Mother's Day panel yesterday. We had some mamas up there and sharing parenting tips, advice, and all that good stuff. How'd you feel about yesterday overall? Did you enjoy being up there and talking with the other ladies?
It was super great talking about parenting journey. And then I went home, got my daughter, took her to my mom's house for dinner, and she threw up everywhere and had like the 24-hour flu.
Welcome to life as a mom.
Happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day. What was so both services were similar for the most part. The questions were the same, but we had a couple of different questions in the second service from the first service. But just from your vantage point, what was one of your favorite parts or piece of advice that maybe you heard another one of the moms say that you're like, oh, that's good. I need to apply that in my own life.
You know, there was some good advice, but I think the most valuable thing was just hearing from other moms that you respect and then hearing them say, yeah, sometimes I hate parenting.
That was my wife. That was my wife that said that.
It's just like, so I talked to like more people afterwards that were like, oh my gosh, really? Because like you can love your kids unconditionally and be really mad at them all at the same time.
You think that's true of God?
Of what? God towards us?
Yeah.
Well, I think you can see plenty of examples where God's like, what are you guys doing down there?
Yeah.
You know, but none of that took away from his forever plan to rescue and have a relationship.
Yeah.
You know, but the idea that we can have two feelings at the same time is not in our vocab.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that a lot of times people just have rose-colored glasses, either looking back and they forget all the difficulties, right? And they're like, oh, I mean, I talk to my mom all the time and she's like, it's like, I feel like I'm the worst parent ever because she's like, oh, you guys never did any of that kind of stuff. I'm like, no way. Like,
seriously.
And that doesn't help. Like when you are in the trenches of like agony of parenting, you're like, the last thing you want is someone to be like, I don't know, I never had that problem. You guys were perfect angels. You're like, no, tell me how much I sucked, please, because that helps me know I'm not a bad parent, right?
You turned out okay.
I mean, the verdict's still out on that. Well, I think so.
Ooh, once I became an adult and I realized like my parents went through so much when we were growing up. Like they weren't financially perfect. Like they had marriage problems. And I was like, why didn't you tell me any of this earlier? Like I thought I was like falling below what I experienced and realizing like, oh, we're all just figuring it out.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite parts just happened in second service, but I appreciated that you shared something I think is very pertinent today and really important for parents to hear. But you talked about growing up and you were more of a tomboy. Yeah. And the question that was asked was, what is your greatest fear right now? And you're about ready to have another baby enter the world. And so what is one of your great fears of Reagan, right? That's her name?
Yeah.
Reagan coming into the
Kennedy.
World. And you said, like, well, based upon if my daughter is like I was when I was her age, there's definitely a mold that people are going to try to place her in. Yeah. And I guess I want to just ask you, because I don't think everyone got to hear that. They weren't second service. Talk more about that, like in the sense of that we have this time where people are wanting to put kids in boxes based upon particular gender types or not traditional gender types.
Yeah.
And even want to do that at a very young age. So for you, especially since you oversee, birth through pretty much college age here at Rise City Church, talk about the importance of influence, of educators, when it comes to identity and gender for kids at young ages.
Yeah. What's hard is that it's just so, like for parents right now, there's so much fear. And so it's really just hard. Like we have to like, first of all and foremost, like stop and acknowledge God's lordship over our lives, over our kids' lives, and over the world. So like no matter what the culture decides to throw at us or our kids, our mission and our security in Jesus is not shifted. Yeah. And like, we have to start with a deep breath in that truth. And then we can enter into like the rest of these conversations. Because even as Christian parents, we get trapped up in like, oh my gosh, I have to do these 5 things or my kid isn't ever going to whatever. And like, that has to be God's realm.
Yeah.
And then within that, then we can have the conversations of like, when I was growing up, I was just a major tomboy. And I remember I cut my hair really short because I didn't want to spend time brushing it. What a waste of time. And like I would wear boys' clothes, and at recess, I was the best flag football player out there.
No way.
And
No way.
The coaches were like, "Oh, Mariah, you're making the boys feel bad."
I think you're looking back with rose-colored glasses right now. I don't
dude,
know.
I'll play you flag football. And like I just loved doing all that stuff, and I just was not anywhere near the mold of what you thought like a girl should be.
Yeah.
And even as even as an adult now, I still don't kind of like fit that mold. I like to go out and adventure, and I'm driven, and I'm always talking, and
You're not in the kitchen all the time.
I'm terrible in the kitchen.
We know that. No, you tell us that. So
I'm so terrible. And my husband and I were both terrible at cooking and housekeeping. I can't believe our kids are living. But I remember telling my mom, I was like, I want to be a boy. I remember telling her once, like, I'm not brushing my hair anymore. Boys only comb their hair. And I'm not doing anything that girls do because I want to be a boy. And my mom at one point, like, talked to my grandma. She told me this years later, like, is something wrong with Mariah? Like, should I be intervening? Like, and my grandma's advice to her was, she's a third grader. Like, give her some time. Like, let her figure it out. Like, she doesn't have to be exactly, I was my mom's first girl. She doesn't have to be exactly what you thought you were or what other people think she should be. Like, my mom's friends would tell me, like, you'll learn to sit and look pretty. And I was like, no, I won't. I still haven't quite mastered it. But I just worry, like, in this generation, like if I was born now and I had trusted adults in my life that were telling me like, oh, this is actually a sign that maybe you're not a girl.
yeah.
I would have been so confused. And like, that scares me that we're not giving kids enough time to just figure it out and be kids.
Yeah.
We're drawing these boxes for them that are so small. And I feel like as Christians, like evangelical Christian culture, we have to own our part in that, because we're drawing these boxes that like, well, if you like the color pink, that's a girl color, and you'd like to do this or that. And then when our kids don't fit those molds, they feel displaced, even in our Christian churches.
Yeah.
And then they don't know where to go for full acceptance. And there's a whole culture out there telling them, well, I know where you can go for acceptance. And they're such easy prey for culture.
Wow. So what would you say then to the parent out there of maybe a younger child? Like, should they have legitimate fears though of you know, the whole school debate right now of what is taught in school, and having these conversations about gender and sexuality at young ages? Like, is that a legitimate fear that parents should have, or is like, oh no, don't worry about that, and you don't make a big deal about that?
Well, we need to be concerned and educated about whatever our kids are going to be educated on. And we need to be educated before they get educated. So this is the time where we need to be understanding these things more fully as parents. And my recommendation in all the realms is like, whether you choose to put your kid in a homeschool situation or a private school, you guys are crazy.
I never thought I'd say yay to homeschool. I never thought I'd say yay.
I have a degree in education, and I do not have what it takes to be a homeschool mother. Or you do private school or whatever the case. Your child is going to be told this stuff by culture. Like, their friends are going to talk about it.
But is it a wise parenting move to try to shelter them from what age they begin to have to process this, or it doesn't really matter?
So what I would suggest is you always want to be the first one to talk to your kid about it.
Okay.
The first person to tell your kid about whatever will have a disproportional amount of influence, no matter what we're talking about. If we're talking about porn, gender, marriage, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's what's scary is that like your average age of kids seeing porn for the first time is coming down to like age 9, age 8. And so as a parent, it's this really hard place of like, well, I don't want to expose my kid to that knowledge too early, but if I wait too long and culture does it for me, then that's a problem. Like there's a very true age-old saying now with like youth pastors of like, either parents, you're going to educate your kids on sex, or the internet's going to do it.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of make that choice. So what I would suggest is introducing small concepts as young as possible. Like we'll talk to my daughter Kenna about like, hey, out in the world, people do things their own way and they think that's the best way to live. But your dad and I, we think God's way is the best way to live. And that's how we make our choices. And so we have that foundation in our family of like, well, what's God's way? That's what we're going to do. And so when it comes time, like my daughter asked me like, I'm going to marry my friend who lives down the street. And she's like, I said, oh, well, I thought, don't you want to marry a boy? And she's like, no, I'm going to marry a girl. It's my choice. And I'm like, you are 4 years old.
This is your daughter?
This is my daughter, Kenna. And I'm like, well, people are making those decisions, but we want to do things God's way because we really believe he has the best for us. So, we're going to teach you God's way.
Yeah.
And she's like, okay, fine, I'll marry Alex down the street, but she's so little. So we're trying to engage in those conversations in like a non-shaming way. We're not talking about how terrible people are, but we're also not shying away from the fact that our family are going to do things God's way.
Right. And it sounds like this may be a phrase that some people don't like, but you're controlling the narrative too. Like I'm not dismissing the reality that this is going on out there. And even maybe to have some of these conversations, maybe at times earlier than I ever would have had or wanted to have, but I'm actually able to somehow control the narrative to talk about it, like you're saying, in a way that's God honoring and also in a way that's not like a permissive license to all these things, but saying, but hold on a second, like we want you to be you, but at the same time, like just because you have these types of feelings or you gravitate towards liking this and that's with that gender and that's not what your gender is, like that doesn't mean that this is who you are. And anchoring the identity in Christ first to being that's who you are. You're a child of God.
And we got to make more room. Like traditional culture discourages boys from liking cooking, which is really ironic because like the top guys, like chefs in the world are all men.
Yeah.
Like what is criminal if your son wants to study fashion or your daughter wants to be a washing machine mechanic? They got great pensions. Yeah. So we need to really hone in on like what is important here.
Yeah, the gender stereotyping of times
because now we're in a culture war over gender stereotyping.
Yeah.
These like kids books used to end with like, this is how you feel, but you're good the way you are. And now books are like, this is how you feel, so we're all gonna accept it. And I'm like, well, what happened to just telling them that they're great the way God made them?
Yeah. But what happens if they do come to the place that this is the way God made them, and in your language, it's outside of what you believe is God's best?
Mm-hmm. Especially as your kids are coming into the teenage years, that's what you're gonna face. Yeah. And I think that you have to understand what your role is as a parent. Like as your kids are entering in those 13, 14, up to 20, like we've given them the best foundation we can, and we're going to continue to. They're going to know that they can come to us for God's ways and God's truth. And we're going to continue to put that into their lives. But they have to start making decisions on their own. And we pray and we hope they'll go God's way because we know, having lived longer, that like God's ways are the best ways. Yeah. But you can't shove that knowledge down your kid's throat. They're not going to, it's not going to take. Yeah. So you continue to be that place of truth and safety and for sure set boundaries that you need to set. Yeah. But you can't force your child into believing in Jesus. And that's the age-old debate.
Yeah, and I think sometimes with just even the, stereotypes, like I think certain gravitational moves into, like you mentioned, fashion or things like that. There are certain, even the arts, like there's certain expressions of gender and sexuality that are more predominant in certain areas. And I think sometimes that fear that you're talking about is what gets the best of parents. But as a dad of 4 and young kids, like I had I thought about this yesterday. I was like, what holiday has the leprechauns? That's St. Patrick's Day, right? Okay, yeah. So, and I heard someone say this as well. They're like, it's crazy that like at school, like they're taught that there's leprechauns, and my kids came home looking for leprechauns, and like. And yet these are the same kids that believe there's leprechauns, and we're also going to talk to them about gender and sexuality at the same age. It's like can we just like realize that like these are really unformed minds, and let's move past leprechauns before we go towards
That's why we don't teach our kids that Santa's real, Brandon.
This podcast is about to end because Mariah's employment is about to end. So hey, I want to go somewhere else. This is digging deeper.
Okay.
So one of the things that I did notice yesterday, and I thought it was really awesome, because you also were vulnerable to share about having 3 miscarriages, and now you're pregnant, and we were praying and believing that Reagan's coming into the world, but you shared your heart on all that, and as you're sitting there, you're rubbing your belly
she was kicking,
over and over,
like in the kidney. I got something to do here, kid.
It's like you got a microphone here, and you're like,
chill.
You're doing this. Like you're watching, you're like, oh, it's like okay, and I mean, so here's what my mind was going to, because another cultural thing right now is Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
And as I'm watching, I'm thinking, I wonder what Mariah thinks in terms of this national debate with potentially the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the federal law of abortion being struck down. And Mariah is someone who's experienced great heartache and loss with miscarriages, longing to have a child. And so there's got to be, in my mind, that side to you that's like, my goodness, like the life of a child, like how could we terminate a life? But there's also, knowing you're women's rights, and you're going to push forward the envelope to say, hey, we have a voice too. So I'm curious, just how do you process that? Because that is right front and center of all of us right now.
Yeah,
as a
it's
woman,
my entire social media.
Okay, so I mean, this is an opinion, right?
Yeah.
But I would love to just hear, how are you processing just that, and maybe responding to people asking you?
Yeah, what's really interesting, I had this conversation with a friend that in most states right now, I could still terminate my pregnancy. Yeah. And it just blows my mind. But I have a couple of thoughts on it. It's painful to watch in the culture, because at the core of it, our culture and the heart of God are so not together right now that it's incredible to watch. What's interesting, a lot of people are quoting Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's got some really powerful quotes, and she's a woman that I really admire. Her work has been really outstanding in a lot of ways. But she has this quote about how a woman's body is not fully her own until she has full control over her reproductive rights. And I am so in agreement with that. You need to have full control over whether you want to be a mom or not be a mom.
Sure.
And then she concludes this quote with, therefore, abortion must be legal. And I'm like, whoa, how did we go from there to there? As if our culture believes that's the only conclusion we could possibly have to women need full autonomy, therefore abortion. And I think that's a complete logical fallacy. As I really do believe that women need to have full autonomy over themselves. Things like marital rape is not something that's well prosecuted in our culture. Yeah. They're kind of like, well, you're married. So, and there's not, women need to have full control. But once you become pregnant is when our culture starts to have that conversation. They don't think about, I need full control over reproductive rights, so I need to control the way in which I'm sexual. They don't start the conversation until after pregnancy. Yeah. And that's where it comes into clash with our Christian viewpoint and mine personally. Yeah. So our culture believes that everyone has a right to sex and sexuality as if it was breathing, like it was a human right. Yeah. And then the fact that a kid might be produced by it is a completely unrelated side topic, as if they and that's why we can't cross this cultural divide, because of that core belief. And I don't know how to scale that mountain, because our culture will not come off that belief that everyone is entitled to sex and that sex is for your personal enjoyment. Yeah,
but it also has the procreative
as
byproduct, possibly.
As Christians, we believe that sex is a fun, awesome thing that bonds two people together, and if the byproduct of that is a baby, then great, because you're now in a committed relationship. It's like, so to not have a safe relationship for sex means you're probably not going to have a safe relationship for a baby. And so our culture just can't look at it the same way that we can. And I have no idea how to make them.
Yeah.
And so all the debates of like, it's murder, is not going to change anyone's, not going to change their mind, because it's not getting to the core of why they believe abortion needs to be legal.
Yeah, and it seems like in the debate in general, it's probably just there's a vacuum of empathy in general in our culture. And in this war, like I am pro-life, you know, I believe wholeheartedly in that baby being born. I also have empathy in situations where sometimes we're creating this opportunity to abort in circumstances, right? Rape, incest, types of things, which are like, gosh, like I don't even know how I'd process that with my daughter. Like I want to have empathy. Like that's terrible. Like and so it's not like just black and white. And so there's got to be empathy, but you can't just like, just licensed termination of a baby. But then I also this past week heard a friend of mine sharing. He said, you know, as Christians, we need to speak up about this. But at the same time, he's like, many Christians are not so much pro-life as they are pro-birth. And he said, like, we're fighting for the birth side of things, which is great. But if we're really pro-life, then in those situations where there's an unwanted pregnancy or there's, you know, a single mom involved, like, what are we doing to really rally around that baby, that mom, right after she's born? Are we fighting just as vigilant in those moments as we are for the actual birth of the child? And so I think it's a very messy conversation.
I think they can feed each other.
Yeah.
But they don't need to be exclusive. Like, I don't think that, like, well, what are you doing to support foster families should be silencing us. I think we should be like, yeah, that's a great point. We should double down on that. It doesn't need to end the conversation. But I also, with my infertility and all of that, I exist in a world, like I'm in part of multiple, I have a super rare genetic disorder that causes these miscarriages. And I'm part of a group with other women that have this disorder. And it's fascinating to hear them talk about Roe versus Wade, because for them, the ability to possibly terminate for medical reasons is a completely different, like these women in my group are like sobbing in tears because they feel like the end of Roe versus Wade means that they can't continue to try for a baby because they're scared that they're going to get pregnant with a baby that is so sick that they can't terminate for medical reasons out of mercy, that they may have to carry this baby who they know is sick and in pain all the way to term because that's what the law says. And they're afraid to get pregnant again because it might mean that.
Yeah.
And so their discussions about abortion are completely just different than the discussions of a 20-year-old college student.
Sure.
And like, so it's just, it's all over the place.
Yeah. And I think it's really important that we are able to have these types of conversations. It's weird that this is broadcast over a podcast, so there's not like a conversation that comes back, but to be able to sit down and talk with people, to hear stories, to understand, to have empathy. And I think it's okay. It's good to have conviction, right? It's good to have conviction. But I think that the moment we stop listening and hear just even that situation, like there are dynamics and nuances that are important to at least listen to versus just kind of scream at the other side, whatever side you're on.
There's a great saying that if you can start with your sentence with, I just don't understand why then you've just admitted that you don't have enough understanding yet to cast whatever heavy judgment you're about to throw down.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like just take a minute, figure it out. I think in most situations for me, it's hard for me to think of a situation where I would stop being pro-life.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Me too.
But how can I expect them to come to the table and listen to me? When I'm not ready to listen to them.
Yeah.
So I just, it's wild, but it does not change that law, and the Supreme Court does not change my mission.
Yeah.
It does not change what we need to do, especially in California. It means nothing.
Yeah.
Like it's not going to change anything in California. We need to keep doing all the same things we've been doing.
Yeah.
So like, force our opinions, but
Yeah. And I anchored myself probably even deeper. I've always been, I guess, in that category, you say pro-life, but like as a Christian ethic, like one of the distinct, notable aspects of early Christians was that they went, the Roman Empire would
with exposure.
Exposure, yeah, and it was the Christians that would go and take these children in that they were essentially being thrown away,
right?
And that was notable of Christians. It was like of their love, they'd welcome in these unwanted children, and it was like, and that type of a love and sacrifice is really what eventually, I think, shifted the entire Roman Empire and began to help people see, like, man, there's something different about Christians because they're to be known by their love. And
it's a great plug for foster care.
Yeah.
My husband and I got licensed for foster care in another state, and we just had no idea what that mission field was.
Yeah.
I'm like, let's let this motivate you to something. Maybe you're not a foster parent, but maybe you can support a foster family.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to say before we close, I really appreciate you going there and just talking about it. But it's what's in every one of our news cycles right now. Like I said, social media. One of the things that we did miss yesterday, and so if you're listening and this is you, I want to talk to you. We on the panel did not have a mom that had middle school, high school, like teenagers, or even college age young adult, and so. That's one of the things when we plan, like sometimes it's digging deeper, like, hey, let's go behind the scenes. What were you thinking? Like, we were trying to get a spectrum of ages and experience, and Colleen Crandall, has a daughter who's 40. So at one point she was a middle schooler or a teenager, but we really didn't highlight that. And so I guess just a quick plug, like for the parents out there right now, we're just saying, where do I look to help in parenting at this age? Like, could you maybe what's some resources to point them towards if they have teens or young adults?
Yeah, absolutely. We heard from a few families that were like, hey, what about teenagers? I think that's such a good thing for our church, because 5 years ago, no one would have asked because no one had teenagers.
Yeah.
Like, how great that our church is growing and our students are growing. That is awesome. But yeah, the teenagers are extremely.
Yeah.
I've never been a parent of a teenager, but as a youth pastor, I've seen hundreds of teenagers going through those stages. And I've been lucky enough to watch them grow up and be just fine.
Yeah.
Whew. But just for starters, for parents, we have some great resources you can access online. It's actually called Axis, AXIS. And it is full of these conversation kits that you can watch and do trainings.
They're so good. They're really good.
They're impossibly good. I'm like, again, they did another
amazing.
good one.
Yeah.
So you can watch them as a parent. Like there's ones on how do I talk with students about transgender? How do I talk with them about vaping? All kinds of topics that you can do a training on yourself. And then they give you a guide of like, hey, watch this video with your student and talk it through.
Yeah.
So Access is a great, great resource. And then just as like a general, like I'll leave us all with the same advice that we talked about on Sunday is, are you becoming the adult that you're praying your student is going to grow up to become?
Yeah.
Because they're watching you. Like, are you praying? Are you getting up to spend time with God? Like that stuff is now going to be 10 times more important to them than anything you have to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you. So grateful on our staff.
Happy to be here.
It's really cool to have Mariah here, and I think we'll have her back again sometime.
Anytime.
And it doesn't just have to do with parenting. Like you got other things to offer as well. So yeah, hope that you make sure to watch the Mother's Day panel if you haven't got a chance to see that. We'll be back in Acts this coming Sunday, and so we'll jump back in there for Digging Deeper next week. But
Sweet.
Appreciate you listening in, and give us your feedback. How do you feel about some of this stuff? Because it's good to have conversations.
There'll be no opinions on
well,
anything
if they're
we talked
watching
about.
it, they can know. Oh, you mean they won't have opinions?
I'm
Yeah,
just
well, there's
joking.
plenty of opinions. Actually, send all emails to Mariah at ridecitychurch.com.
If you can't find someone there to pick a bone with, I don't know.
Yeah. So, all right. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next week.